All right, John McCarty here with Odyssey Test Prep alongside JP. Today we're going to dive deep on some reading comprehension topics and general strategies and how to improve your reading comprehension score. So, JP, I guess what have you seen with some of the students that you've worked with, some of the roadblocks that they've hit, or some of the advice that you've seen be particularly useful for them?
Yeah, so I think it's RC is always interesting, right, John? Because I think you could say for LR, or we don't have games anymore, but I think LR and games were a little more foreign, more of a novel concept to people beginning their LSAT journey. But for RC, we've seen RC type like questions, and like RC is reading. So a lot of times students will say, how do I get better at reading? And I think what is really important is maybe changing the perspective a little bit in how we approach RC. So one thing that I think about right away is low res and high res and how we approach and engage with the passage. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. Having different gears that you can shift into as far as how much you're looking to retain and like what kind of information you're looking to retain as you move through the passage, I think can be really important, because there's some stuff that you really want to internalize and track and know. Those things being more on the structure side, the overall argument, the overall information within the passage, how things are relating to each other, those types of things. And then little pops of more specific detail-oriented things that you're probably not going to remember. And if you try to go super high-res on every single detail, you're not going to remember everything unless you have that special kind of mind. But for most of us, finding ways to notate, to come back to those details. So when you see a detail, like knowing that, all right, this is something I need to notate or have some way of recognizing that it's important, but it's not going into like my working memory that I'm actually like in the passage trying to figure out the structure, and where you're kind of a little low res on the details, but you know exactly how to come back to them and get high res when you need to, once you hit a question about it.
I really like that analogy made with the gears, right? Because I think a lot of times students, what I've seen is they go into it and then they're trying to get every single thing down, and it's like, I want you guys to realize that the words aren't going to go anywhere, right? If you need to remember what that confusing science mechanism was, or that airy art description was, it's still going to be there. Just remember it's in this part of the passage, and it might be confusing, but with the gear analogy, right? It's like, what purpose does this serve? We might be confused as to what it means, but exactly like you said, low res, in our own words, what is going on there, right? Put very simply, is it good? Is it bad? Serve an example. And I think by switching to gears and realizing those two different ways of operating, I think RC becomes a little bit more tangible. I mean, we kind of have like building blocks that we can work on, right? Where it's like, how do I get a little bit better at, synthesizing and seeing how everything connects, rather than just reading and being like, oh, I just read something, but I have no idea what happened. Or I just read it multiple times. I'm so confused. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And for sure, you got one read on it. So if you're reading it twice or three times, you got to find a way to get to one read. There's only time for one read, unless you have like a bunch of extended time or something like that. But for most people, you get that one read. So your strategy has to be to where by the time you're done with it, that you know where everything is, you know what purpose most things are serving, you know what the main point is, and you're moving into the questions. And then when you get to those, what does this word mean in the context of the passage and line, whatever. You go back to that line, you get it in context, you figure it out, and then you can answer those questions in that way. I kind of think of it as it's like an open book test, right?
Yes.
Because the book is the passage and the questions are right next to it. You have the book there with you. It's right there. Everything's derived from that passage.
Wonderful.
So
yeah.
And if you're thinking about it, what would you do to prepare if you had an open book test with some questions? Well, you would want like a table of contents to be able to reference.
Yes.
You would want to be like organized. You would want to know what the general themes are and where things are and how they connect to each other. You wouldn't try to memorize the whole book, right? But you would really want to be able to be like, oh, when I need this particular thing, I go to page 56 in the book and I know it's right there in paragraph 3, and now I can answer the question. So think, if you kind of change the frame in which you're thinking about it, I think that can help a lot.
And that, I think that's crucial, right? Because that table of contents that we're getting at, that we really want listeners to hold on to, is it leads to more purposeful reading, right? Because I think a lot of times I've seen students and they read and it just kind of goes in one ear, goes out the other, right? Where it's like, what?
Yeah.
I've read something, but I honestly, I don't really know what I read, right? But I think
and
when
I've
you
done
start
that in
reading,
practice too.
Oh, 100%. Right? Yeah. I have no idea what Yeah.
So when it happens, you just have to figure out, you have to be working towards it not happening, right?
Yes. And I think in recognizing the gear aspect, right? Like on what level am I reading through this passage, right? There's those two gears, right? Where, I take a step back and say, okay, in paragraph 1, whose viewpoints are we talking about? Okay, we're talking about other people's viewpoints. And in paragraph 2, it kind of switches a little bit where we get a little bit of the author's own opinions, and it seems to clash a little bit, and okay, that sets the stage for the main argument. And so, there's the broad strokes, and then we can get into the nitty gritty, right? Where it's like, what, like, and like, how is this point being made, right? Is it like this counterexample? Is it like through an extended analogy? Like, what purpose does this one part serve? I think,
and even things as simple as like, which 4 of these 5 answer choices were listed as an example for the situation that was described in paragraph 4. Just like very like super tactical, like these very specific things. You're going to get a whole bunch of different kinds of questions like that.
I think that I really like the table of contents that you said, right? Because I think with that, it kind of helps make RC tangible, right? Where we're telling students, like, students oftentimes ask, like, how do I get better at reading? Like it seems a little bit like fluff, like airy, where LR is like, okay, this is sufficient assumption, this is necessary. Do I feel comfortable on lesson without? And then, games, there's like, they're like a little bit more tangible in the milestones that we get, right? Whereas RC is like, how do I get better reading? Where it's like, oh, okay, maybe I get confused with like the main point of the passage questions, but it students often tell me that it feels a little bit more like airy. And I think by having this perspective of gears and having this perspective of table of contents and having this perspective on structure, it kind of helps have like, it puts like skills on a table where we can measure our progress, right? Where it's like, okay, I'm getting a little bit better at like seeing how things relate to one another, or like, oh, my table of contents is getting like a little bit clearer. I read through it and
more used.
Yeah, the mental mapping. I think these are skills that we can measure our progress, and just having that purpose, right? Where it's I'm reading the words on a page, but I'm also increasing engagement because I'm thinking about these things.
Yeah. And I would go as far as to say, you are not going to become a better reader in the time frame you're studying for the LSAT. You are not going to become a faster reader in the time frame you're studying for the LSAT. These are skills that take years to improve substantially on, right? You may maybe a tiny bit, it's not going to be impactful. So if you're spending your time trying to become a better reader or a faster reader, I think you're spending your time in the wrong areas. Like you said, build the skills that are going to be useful on the LSAT. And those skills are, being able to see how things relate to one another, picking out main points from what you're reading, which is not something people typically do, right? If you're reading a novel, you're not thinking like, what's the main point here? Or and picking out argumentation, looking for very specific areas. If there's causality that's standing out to you, you're not becoming a better reader, you're becoming a better LSAT taker. And you really need to find the skills that are going to improve your LSAT score and focus on those. Don't try to become faster. If you try to read faster, you're going to read faster than you can comprehend or faster than you're used to. It's going to be in one ear and out the other. And that's one of the problems people have. It's like, if I can read this thing in 3 minutes, I see a lot of stuff out there. Like, you got to have the passage done in 3 minutes. And then you got to have
30 seconds. Yeah.
3 minutes and 30 seconds. Right. I'm a slow reader. Like, it would usually take me 4.5 minutes, like somewhere, and I would read very painfully slow, but my mapping got really good over time. And the things that I was looking for, the very specific things that I was looking for, got really good over time. And then when I got to the questions, man, I was in full sprint through those questions because I knew exactly where to go. Bang, here it is. Boom. And I'm moving fast. And I've got I've got everything mentally mapped, physically mapped. And I know exactly what I'm doing in almost every instance once I get to the questions. So like, focusing on this test and what you have at your disposal and what you don't have at your disposal, and then creating the right strategy for you. I do find reading comprehension is pretty, it changes from person to person more than logical reasoning does, because reading speeds vary so much, and because people's note-taking habits are so much different than others.
Yeah. And I think what's core in what we're talking about is increasing engagement, right? Because exactly like we talked about, we've all been there. We've had like empty reading, right? Where we read it and it's like,
oh yeah.
If you ask me, I have no clue what I just read. But this engagement, right? Where it's like, we're not just reading, but there's all these like skills and things on a table that we're mindful of and that we're improving upon. And I think, honestly, when I saw a big jump in RC for myself is I wouldn't just read through the passage, but I would really engage with it. Meaning, John, like, I would see something and I would be like, okay, it would almost be like a conversation. And that's kind of like the level where I want students to get at, where it's, we're reading and then, we're anticipating, right? Like, okay, you seem to be downplaying the importance of this one particular thing. Are you going to suggest a solution? Are you going to, talk about other people's viewpoints? Like, where are you going with this, right? And maybe I'm unclear for certain like parts of like certain like, oh, with this analogy, it's, I think I see what he's saying there, but I'm engaging with it in a high level, and they throw so many different topics at us, and and talking to students, there's like, oh God, like, I hate the science passages, or it's the art passages for me. And but I think by being engaged, right, by thinking about these things that we're putting on the table, by anticipating, kind of having that conversation, it kind of makes the passages we don't like more palatable, and we start approaching RC in a much different way. When we have that, like, oh, what's going to come next? Or, wait, you just said this. How did that relate to that? I think that anticipation aspect has been huge because it keeps me on my toes, right? I think it does a very good job of warding off that like empty reading, like just going through it. I have no idea what's happening. I'm not stopping, but it's like I have like little stops, right? Where it's like, okay, like, oh, so you're focusing on other people's opinions, but where does your opinion come in, right? Or like, maybe in this last part, you're gonna talk about future opportunities within this, or maybe you're gonna tell us what your opinion is on like on this final note here. Yeah.
Yeah, because
I,
that kind of predictive, anticipative reading um, makes you start to gather evidence for whatever your hypothesis as to where they're going
yes.
is. You're like, oh, they said this and they said that, and so you start to kind of like map things together and come
Yeah.
up with like where you think it's going. And then you get this great reward at the end. If you were right, you're like, ah, I knew it, I got you. And if you were
Yeah.
wrong,
Gotcha.
you're like, oh,
Oh,
that's surprising. They could do
yeah.
this thing too. And then you're like, oh,
Yeah.
that's interesting.
Yeah. And you know what it is, John? It's kind of like before, students reading and it's like whoosh, like a race car, right? It's like, what was around me? I have no clue, right? Let me go back again, right? I was like, let's make a little circle, like, whoosh, right? But I think with this, it's
Yeah.
like it it's a little slower. It's purposeful, right? And it's we're walking and we're seeing, oh wow, there's so many things on this field, right? And it's like, oh, okay, I turned this corner. What's going to be here? Um, I think um, it just leads to seeing RC in a different light. I think once you start playing with that kind of engagement and mapping things out, where it's like, oh, I'd even notice like um some of these passages are a little cookie cutter with their structure, right? Like, oh, like, you do
Yeah.
bring up a good point where sometimes it's to start with someone else's opinion, further elaborate on that opinion, bam, our author's opinion, right? And it's like, oh, I
Yeah.
want everyone to be mindful of those switches, right? Where maybe before race car, oh, okay, like we're just talking about the same thing, but it's like, oh, like there's a little nuance here where it's like, this point on, this table of contents part right here, this is where it changes, right? And this is where we're getting some like nitty gritty um, author opinion, or this is where the controversy arises, right? Um,
Right.
I think that it's like seeing a world that you didn't otherwise see when you would just not read for like LSAT reading, this purpose driven
Yeah.
mental mapping, like intentional reading.
Yeah, and these patterns are going to emerge. Like they're going to ask you
Yeah.
about examples or counterexamples. They're going to ask you about causality. They're going to ask you about conditional reasoning if that's there. They're going to ask you about author's attitude. They're going to ask you about the main point. Like these are things that we know are going to happen. If you do enough of these reading comp passages, you know what you're looking for. They're not asking you about prepositional phrases, right? That's not like
Yeah.
a question that's going to happen on the LSAT. So
Like,
yeah, and I like this idea of, um, you know, reflecting and anticipating. You should probably have that after every paragraph. Like that,
yeah.
reflect on what you've read really quickly. Make sure that you've got your mental map of that and your table of contents is being built and you feel comfortable with how that looks. And then anticipate what's coming next. And after every paragraph, if you're doing this like reflecting, anticipating, you're going to start to build that story. It's going to come together in a really cohesive way that I think is conducive to scoring well. And it does take a fraction of a second. It takes some time, right? So if you're pedal to the metal through the whole thing, you're not taking these pauses to reflect and anticipate, because you don't feel like you have the time to do it. You're going to read the whole passage and you're going to come up empty, and then you're in the questions, and then man, you could burn so much time in those questions trying to go
Yeah.
dig around for the answers that you have no idea where they are.
I really like the point you said about timing, right? Because I think I do have a lot of students tell me like, hey, it takes me a little bit to read this, and you want me to like slow down even more. Like I'm scared about my timing of the questions, and that's something I try to get across to them, where I say like, oh, just try implementing this strategy, and you'll be surprised at how, because you spent a little bit more time on like the stimulus, then the questions like um the answer choices are not as attractive because you spent that little like fraction of a second in creating that structure and anticipating and checking. I tell students to do the same. I tell them read, try to see it in parts, right? Like by paragraph, and after you finish a paragraph, just briefly touch base with yourself, right? Like what was the main takeaway there? What was is it good? Is it bad? Is an example setting the stage? Just very briefly, main takeaway, read the next paragraph. What's the main takeaway? Pause. How do they connect? I think
Yep.
that
How do they connect is
it,
important. Yeah.
yes, it takes time, but you really, the questions become a lot more pleasant. And it's not to say that, um, like we don't know, like, sometimes there's a very confusing part in the stimulus, and then, like, we don't know what parts the questions will focus on, right? And I know sometimes it's like some strategies are like, oh, like let's look at all the questions, and but I think, in reading the passage, we and reading it intentionally, if they ask us on a part that we, maybe it's a high risk part and we didn't focus on it, like, oh, it's fine because we have our table of contents. Like, where was that part? That was in the middle. Okay, what was he doing in the middle? In the middle, he was talking about a comparison between this and something else. Like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, like it sets the stage. Okay, this part was around that. Like, oh, okay, I remember the conclusion was that like one side won. So then it becomes a lot clearer, even if that high risk part is a little weird, right? And of course, we go back, we see how it is in that particular context. Um, but because we spent, those brief seconds to touch base, um, the map just becomes a lot clearer. The surroundings, the environment. Um, so I definitely agree.
And the cool thing about this too is through your practice, you get to keep creating these maps and then compare them to the master map, which is the questions that they actually asked. So if
Yeah.
you get, if you have a ton of stuff in your map that questions never got asked about, you think, well, okay, maybe that stuff isn't quite as important. But if you have a lot of questions that are asked that aren't in your map, then you have to say, oh, okay, well, I need to start looking at those things and being able to make, so you start to compare like your map to the questions that are asked
Yeah.
and start to dial those in. And like
Yes.
you want to be working towards an unattainable goal of like everything that you have mapped has a question, and every question that was asked, you have one thing mapped for that in your
Yeah.
kind of in your mental map and in your table of contents. Now you'll never get there consistently,
Yeah.
but if you're working towards that, then you're starting to dial that content into what was actually asked, and now you're like actually like reverse engineering
Yes.
um, what you're paying attention to based on what the LSAT has been asking, and now you're engaging with the test on a much deeper level than here's a passage and anything could be asked after this. Certainly it
Yeah.
could, but there's those patterns that you'll start to recognize when you start to look for them.
Yeah, I think everything that we always talk about, John, is just keeping the engagement very high and trying to get rid of like fluff and empty studying, right?
Yeah.
Where um, reading for structure will always be helpful, right? How does this relate to what came after? What was the main takeaway, right? What um, just in broad strokes, um, even if they don't ask about structure, um, by having that structure for your table of contents, it'll just help you so much with the questions. And I think when the LSAT starts to click at different stages, it's because students are seeing the test differently. They're engaging a little bit differently, right? Um, and for RC, one thing that what we said for LR, and I think is also applicable to RC, is, um, you know, a lot of things are just patterns, meaning, um, when we see a certain passage, there could only, a lot of the formats of the passages tend to get repeated. So
Yeah.
um, it's good if we have like an inventory, right, where maybe there is a sufficient assumption question that really stumped us. I guess parallel to LR, and then we like the essence of that essay question is something that gets brought up in other instances, but then we have that like our poster child for like essay, right? And then we have it in our
Yeah.
toolbox so that when we engage with things that are of that particular context or of a similar context, it's like, oh, okay, like I know, like I've been here before, right?
Right.
I think that's quite helpful for RC in terms of the questions or in terms of the passages, right? Where it's
Yep.
like you said, you know, sometimes we're reading, we're anticipating, it's like, oh, like that was a surprise. You actually, you know, you did like a little 180 there, like okay,
Uh-huh.
like oh, I'll be like mindful in the twists and turns or um, you know,
Right. And
you know, off,
if
yeah,
you're not predicting through the passage, if you're not anticipating, you never get that moment of surprise because you never anticipated where it was going to go. So you don't get that like moment of like, whoa, this is different. And then, oh, I got to map this and I got to have this as one of my templates because this is something that they might do. If you just go through it, you never get that moment. So you never like really catalog it in
yeah,
quite the same way.
yeah, and I think um, a lot of times in talking about RC in the way that we're talking, students um will be like, oh, you know, I'm doing all this mental mapping, I'm like checking base, like it it like 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 don't my like reading skills or my reading comprehension already have to be like super high to start implementing this? Or I think what I'm trying to get at is like a lot of times students are not comfortable with ambiguity. And that's something that I often see myself trying to get across, right? Where I tell them like, oh guys, it's, you know, in this particular science passage where they talk about like oxidation or
Yeah. Yeah.
like the synthesis of corn, you know, in
Yep.
this like kind of like
Absolutely.
complex level. It's
Yeah.
fine. It's fine if we're
Okay.
a little bit like iffy on how it's happening, but I want you to take a step back. Why are they talking to us about this, right? And in this particular section, um, does it lead to something else? Does it lead to like, oh, because we have this like mystery mechanism, it is imperative that we blank, you know, like it's okay if it's like a little airy, but how do we engage with it, right? Because I feel like sometimes, you know, they always do that on purpose, right? For whatever the passage, or
Yeah.
maybe like for the law passage or something, it's like you just reread it, reread it. It's like, what is happening here? But it's like, okay, you don't have to read it a million times, right? And then like bang your head against the wall. But if we take a step back, you know, we're comfortable in how it is situated in that particular context, and we're comfortable in our table context, and we're mindful to purpose, we're mindful to like tone and whose opinions being stated, um, then that's okay, right? Because in the questions, um, hey, maybe they'd even ask about that, or maybe, you know, they do, and then we spend a little more time. Let's see what the context clues are. Um, but yeah, being comfortable with ambiguity, I think, is leads to a little bit more comfortable reading, right? Where it's not like the house is on fire. Like I don't understand the science mechanism. It's like,
Yeah.
but there's so much more that you understand, and you know, keep moving, keep touching base. Um, it's okay if some parts are ambiguous. You know, I think if anything, that's like to be expected. You know, as a lawyer, you're going to be coming across a lot of things that are novel or a little bit weird. But if you're comfortable with um, engaging with those things, then I think performance can still be quite high.
Yeah. For sure. And even just like words that you can't pronounce. That's okay. Like don't
It's
get
fine.
thrown off by that. That's fine. Who
Yeah,
cares? Like you're reading in your
yeah,
head. You don't have to give a presentation on this afterwards, right?
yeah, yeah,
So sometimes people like waste time trying to pronounce like these, especially like those, 7 syllable scientific words where you're just like, I don't like I have no
yeah.
clue
It's
uh
just H.
what
Yeah,
it's just H, yeah.
it's
It's
just
not
H. Yeah,
hydrocarbon, whatever,
yeah, yeah,
crazy term they're throwing out there. So yeah, you could just call it H or hydro,
yeah,
or you come up with some sort of
yeah,
abbreviation, or pronounce it any way that you want to in your own head,
yeah,
and just make sure that that's the way you're pronouncing it moving forward. So yeah, there's going to be some uncertainty in there. You know, um, reading comprehension is not typically, or at least it wasn't for me, and for a lot of the students that I've worked with, like feel super comfortable the whole time. Like it gets
Yeah.
uncomfortable at times. And, you know, and a lot of times you need to come back and then reread that in the context. And maybe once you've gotten the full context, that it makes a little more
That
sense
makes
what
sense.
was going on in
Yes.
the middle there, uh,
Yeah.
because you have a broader context and you've kind of gone through some questions and kind of sorted some things out a little bit by the
Yeah.
time you got to the question that referenced the thing that you were a little uncertain about. And you've kind of mapped it a little bit better because your understanding of the passage does increase
Evolve.
as you progress through the questions.
Yeah. I I think that's what I'm trying to get at, where, you know, we see that science mechanism there. We see that like airy, art point being made. Um, but it's okay. Keep doing your low res, high res. Take a step back, see how everything connects, and then as we progress, because we didn't read this like 8, 7 times, like bah bah bah, banging our heads against the wall, but comfortable with ambiguity, um, we stuck to what we've been doing. Then as we move on, it's like, like in that context, like, okay, I see what
Yeah.
point you're making, or even in the questions you're reading, it's like, like the comprehension evolves a little bit, but because um, we focus on structure, we focus on how things related, um, we're it kind of leads to like a more comfortable like RC reading experience, and not like the house is
Yeah.
on fire, because we're
Yeah.
attending to these other points um, that create a map of what's happening, and some parts are blurry, like don't worry, like, it's fine. Stick to
Yeah.
um, stick to these broad strokes. Um, One thing I wanted to bring up was um, I know for myself, and perhaps this only works once you're a bit more comfortable with RC, to increase engagement on my end. I um, would, when I would synthesize those paragraphs very briefly, like low res, I would just put things in my own words, right? Like, um, and sometimes, some of the passages there's so many different types of topics, and, not all the topics are going to hit.
Yeah.
So sometimes to make it more fun, I would just, I don't know, like put in a joke in there, or kind of like put in my personality. But it's like, because I'm not comfortable with engaging with RC, the little tidbits that I would add, it would just like be to like humor myself, or like to kind of like,
Right.
um, like create this picture that works for me. So I know some students, they would tell me like, oh, like put things in my own words. Like, I'm so scared that I'm going to add something that actually isn't there. But it definitely is a spectrum, right? Because I know some students, when I
Yeah.
tell them to start synthesizing, in broad strokes, what was paragraph one, sometimes they'll just go in and they'll just reread sentence one, sentence two, sentence three. It's like, oh, like the words aren't going to go anywhere, right? And I want to make sure that
Yeah.
you, um, because if our synthesis is like verbatim, then it's like, it's not as sticky, right? And
I've
um,
always tried to limit it to
yeah,
3 words. 3 words
yeah,
or less. If I can do it in 1 word for like what was going on in the paragraph,
yeah.
I like that because we're only talking about like
Controversy, angry,
three,
yeah,
yeah, 3 sentences, like, yeah, and like controversy, and then like what the topic of the controversy was.
yeah,
So, like
yeah,
agricultural controversy, but I would just do like
yeah,
ag conch, and like in like
yeah,
really shorthand, um, and just like have that, and kind of map it out on the scrap paper, or maybe with a little bit of highlighting or underlining. Um, and in my own mind, just having that, like, all right, paragraph one was that agricultural controversy. And then
yeah,
I think they're going to go into resolving the controversy. And then I'm moving into, paragraph two. But yeah, I think it's super important that people know, like, if you highlight everything, if you underline everything, if your synopsis is all the words in the paragraph, you're wasting. That is total waste of time. You are doing nothing. You highlight everything, you've effectively highlighted nothing, because everything is now highlighted and nothing is in the low light. So you need to be really judicious with how you're implementing those tools and your even your map, your mind map, and your table of contents that you're creating, like it needs to be tight. Because like you said, and you keep saying, those words are not going anywhere. It's not like they give you the passage, then it's gone and you have to answer these
Yeah.
questions. That would be
Yeah.
brutal, right?
Yeah.
It's still there. It's an open book
Yeah.
test, right? So
Yeah.
just, create that table of contents. You're not writing every word from the chapter in the table of contents. You're just writing the main and a couple of words, a few words, what that chapter is about.
And John, I like what you said about the 3-word thing, because one thing that I've had students say that they like when I try and bring this point across is, and even with LR, right? I guess LR, we have like the little like baby stimulus, or maybe, sometimes they're quite lengthy as well, but
Yeah,
it's
sometimes the parallel ones are
like a
used. Yeah.
mini RC contained thing. But
Yeah.
one thing that students have told me that they like is like I call it like caveman language, where it's like, all right, guys, like let's like very succinctly, it's almost humorous with like the two
Mm-hmm.
3 words that we use, right? It's like yeah, it's like caveman language, and they tell
Yeah,
me
like
like,
rock
oh
fell hard.
yeah, no, exactly, and they'll tell me like, oh, like John, that was actually quite helpful for me when you told me to put things in that way, because then it forces me to like simplify like what like at the core what is happening here, right? And because it's caveman language, it's a little funny. It sticks,
Yeah.
right? It's
Yes.
and it kind of, I feel like it kind of gets students away from, because we've seen it so many times, right? It's like, I have to hold on to every word. It's like let's get rid of some words, and we just have
Yeah.
like uh differing opinions, or like um um oil types, like just something um
Yep.
for our mental map. So I'm a big fan of Caveman language, LRRC. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think
Rock
it's
felt
super
hard.
important to recognize what capabilities you're coming to the table with. How fast can you
Yeah,
read is going to dictate some of the strategy that you use.
yeah,
How much you can retain is going to dictate some of the strategy that you
yeah,
use. And I haven't met anybody that can retain every single word. So if your goal is to retain every word in the whole passage, I've never seen it been done. I've been doing it for 10 years. I'm sure there's one guy out there that can do it, or one girl out there who can, read it and
uh,
memorize everything. And wow, right? But they don't need
yeah,
help on the test, right?
yeah,
They're
yeah,
they're they're going to be just fine, right?
yeah,
So, know what you're, know what kind of this the mechanisms that you have at your disposal, and then you have to work within that. And things that are humorous do stand out to us, and we remember them. Things that are surprising do stand out to us, and we remember them. Things that are shocking do stand out to us, and we remember them. If and kind of the, engaging with the passage. I've always, one thing that I've seen just flip the switch for people is when they realize that the content that they're reading is actually meant to be factual content, right? That it's actually pulled from academic journals and things like that. Where like when you're reading this, like if you get on Jeopardy someday, this information is right. Like you can answer the
yeah,
question, and like the student people are like, "Oh, I'm learning stuff. Oh, I love learning new stuff." And then all of a sudden, they're engaged like crazy because they want to learn
yeah,
all this new information. And yeah, they're
yeah,
studying for the LSAT. They're also just like broadening their base knowledge in so many different fields and
yeah,
realms that it's
yeah.
like super
To
interesting and fun.
explain it, yeah, no,
Yeah, yeah,
um, it's it's so funny that you say that, John, because I with one of my study buddies, um, I remember I was telling you I like had studied, like one of my study buddies was Korea, one was from Michigan, but I was
yeah,
joking with my Korean study buddy, and I was telling her like, oh, it it's kind of funny actually, because through reading so many different RC passages, I've just been exposed to so many different things that I otherwise would not have been exposed to.
right.
So sometimes when you're talking to different people, or something comes up on TV, or you just like meet new people, and a topic gets brought up, it'll be funny because it'll be like, oh, I was studying for the LSAT. I read a passage and like, oh, I'm actually quite familiar with that painting and like,
Yes. Yeah.
the opinions of that painting, or
Yeah.
like,
And
um,
there are some critics of that painting that think,
yeah,
X, Y,
that
Z,
like that happens like quite a bit, like more often than I
Yeah.
would have expected. Where, um, I think they do a good job at, and just the broad presentation of
Yeah.
topics, right? So that it really, like so many instances where it's like I'm I'm like a little familiar with this because of LSAT
Yeah.
reading, So no, it's cool, and I think um it all comes down to engagement, right? Like how do
Yeah.
we engage with LR? How do we engage with RC, right? Because then then we're actually sitting down, then it's intentional, then there's like milestones and things to work on. We're not just kind of reading through it, and then it kind of becomes a little bit more tangible. But I think the learning perspective is good, especially for some things that students may not like, right? Like I know
Yeah.
you're kicking the table, you got this art passage, but
Yeah.
I don't know, you're gonna talk to a stranger and it's like, oh, like,
Yeah.
kind of cool. I know a lot of things about this like French impressionist painter,
Yep. Yeah.
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 Um,
It definitely has like unintended consequences that happen in the rest of your life. And
yeah.
you find that you can kind of be in a lot of different kinds of conversations and have
Conversations,
something
yeah.
to contribute. And, like
Yeah.
all of a sudden you have like this really broad knowledge of a lot of different topics. Um,
Yeah.
and, one thing I want to make sure that we talk about as well is just the must be true nature of reading comprehension. Now, not every question is going to ask specifically what must be true. There's a lot of maybe purpose questions, main point questions still have to be true, so they still kind of fall under that umbrella of must be true. But I find a lot of people are used to reading in a kind of way that's like, I get the gist of it. Like I kind
Yeah.
of get
Yeah.
going on, and I can answer on
Yeah.
based on the gist.
Yeah.
That's not the game we're playing here, right? We're
Yeah.
playing a different game, which is like, what can you absolutely 100% support given the information from the passage? Not what you think might also possibly be true, or because and just knowing the confinements of a standardized test, because what you think might be true about somebody who has these characteristics, you're like, oh well, probably are also quick to anger, because I know a
Yeah.
lot of people who are
Yeah.
like this are also quick to anger.
Yeah.
But in my life, the people who are like that are like really creative, and I might think that they would be creative, right? So you have all these different people coming from different perspectives. There's no way that they can put on the test things that are like you kind of guess from your life experience might be true, because everybody has such different experiences. So they're stuck in this position where all of the answers have to be supported by the passage, and in a way that is 100% supported, at least all the must be true questions. They'll slide in, a few other types, but it's something like 4 out of 5 reading comp questions fall into the umbrella of must be true. So if you find on logical reasoning that you're not doing well on must be true, and your reading comprehension is bad too, that's a pretty good place to start to get a lot of
Yeah.
bang for your buck. Because
Yeah.
some doesn't mean most, many doesn't mean most doesn't mean all. Like all of these things, all the things you would do on a must be true question on logical reasoning, bring those skills over to reading comprehension too. They're going to have answer choices that are exaggerations. They're going to go from
Yeah.
many to most, and it's wrong. You can throw it out because of
All.
that.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
right. And,
Reason why. Yeah.
yes, exactly. So, like, use those skills and have that high benchmark of must be true. I find people's benchmark is like this like sloppy, could be true, probably true, maybe true, on reading comprehension on certain question types, that just needs to be dialed in. And as soon as they dial in what their expectation is for the question, they start getting them correct.
I really like that point, John, because that was the last thing I was thinking about where um it really is like a giant must be true stimulus where
Yeah.
um I think oftentimes students don't realize the standard to which they should hold like evidence because like you said a lot of times students will skip these stones, right? Will make these hops and assumptions and not realize that they're making those hops, right? So I
Right.
think RC um, is quite good at, at, at training us to be mindful of our assumptions. And within this part, what can we say from this? And what does this mean? And I think being in a framework where our standard, our rigor in what is being said and dialing that up from maybe it was like 60, 70. We're making a lot of hops. We start realizing the hops that we're making and then we
Yeah.
start dialing it to like 80, 90. I think um RC becomes the whole ball game changes, I think. And what you're saying in
Yep.
the stimulus is something that I also want to bring up in the answer choice because I think once like I made jumps and I think where I'm very happy to see students start to like click a little bit with RC is where is when they realize, oh, wait a second, a lot of these answer choices they're not as attractive as I previously had thought, right? Because they're
Right.
in saying this, they are making a couple assumptions, or they're
Hmm.
mindful to like the softer hardness of the language, where it's like some okay, like we just need to find one thing like for this particular statement, or they said most like, hey, is are we limited? Like in our passage, we were just talking about one particular instance, and I think in seeing what
It's,
exactly the answer choices are saying, they're
and
just
you,
not as attractive. Yeah.
yeah, and it's also like honing you into the breaking point of the answer choice.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
When you
Yes.
see that most, like if you're not clocking that and you see that most in the answer choice and you just read it for the general vibe of the answer choice, but if you read it and you
Yeah.
see most and you're like, I need to test the most. That's the first thing I'm going to,
Yes.
did they say most? Because
Exactly.
you probably don't
Yeah.
remember. Right.
Yeah.
And you say, I don't remember them saying like really strong language that, and you go back and you test that and you're like, oh, the answer choice breaks immediately. And that like your
Yeah.
speed will go up, your accuracy goes up, like
Yeah.
everything starts to come together once you start to have that must be true criteria like at the forefront through most everything you do in reading comp.
And then for the answer choices, it's nice because it's they just throw a statement at us, and that statement will have various components, right? Oh, difference in how hard the language is, right? Is it like some,
Mm-hmm.
most, maybe, it must be, and then it'll be modulated in a certain way, right? And it'll say like it'll have like an extra component, and it's like okay, like we put the first one to the test, but what do you think about that second component? Because a lot of times I'll see students and they'll be like, oh, I saw that first part and it was great. And I was like, oh, but how about
Yeah.
like, the second part? And they're like, yeah, I guess that one was harder to justify. And it's like, oh, okay, I want you to be
Yeah.
mindful that there are these components and we want to put them to the
Yeah.
test, right? And then, when we're on the fence between those two, three answer choices, it's like, oh, now that I'm applying this higher level of like rigor in this standard, then I see how they're much more different than I had anticipated, right? And um,
Yeah.
yeah, that must be true way of thinking. I think is um, even if the question type that we're looking at isn't a must be true, but because we've honed into that standard, um, we we're just more engaged. I think it just
Yeah.
leads to a more comfortable RC experience. But it does take time to kind of get into that
It
mindset
does.
and
Yeah.
learn like that this game is being played, right?
Yeah. And the first step of that is knowing what game you're playing. And you're playing the must be
Yes.
true game. So like once you
Yeah.
realize that, then you can start to build towards that skill. If you never recognize that, and you think reading comp is kind of a little wishy-washier than logical
Yeah.
reasoning,
Yeah.
you're not playing the game yet. You haven't even
Yeah.
gotten in the arena. And the
Yeah.
LSAT loves those answer choices that start off absolutely beautifully correct, and then they take a turn at the end in the wrong. Well, that last turn, it's got to be 100% correct, not just mostly correct. It's got to be 100% correct. So, definitely keep an eye out for stuff like that.
Like, are we? And then I think I tell students, in choosing this answer choice, are you justified, right? Or backing up this answer choice. So
Show
we,
me. Yeah, prove it.
yeah,
Point to
we
the
want
case,
to, yeah,
place
we
with
want to
it.
be mindful.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, um, like I'm not sure if I made the last point too clear, but yeah, seeing exactly like we're saying this as a big must be true, um, and being mindful of that, right? But there are some questions where they ask us to like infer, or is something's not like what's an implicit thing that we can take away from this, right? And it's like, hey, maybe it's not 100%, but because I see this as a big must be true, I realize that there's varying degrees of like what I can say and what I can't say. But the these components only become clear once you see this as a big must be true. Whereas before it's like, the varying levels of like certainty, they're not even on the table, right? You're just reading, you're just zooming past it. So I think for answer choices for this stimulus, it uh, just becomes more comfortable.
Yeah, and even on the question types that are, what can be inferred? Inferred is always going to lead me to a must be true. So if A, then B, if
Yeah,
B, then C. Well, they didn't
yeah,
say if A, then C, but I can infer that. That is
yeah,
100% true. Even
yeah.
questions like the author would be most likely to agree with which one of the following.
Blank. Yeah.
Go with the answer choice that you can absolutely support, not the answer
Yes.
choice that you think the author might also agree with because of your
Yeah.
perspective of the author.
And I think what's very helpful is once you start playing this game and realizing like hey, the table of contents, hey, I'm going to increase my the standard at which I hold things to be true, right? And being mindful, like, what
Yeah.
exactly does this mean? Um, then you see the assumptions in your own reasoning, right? And backing up an
Yeah.
answer choice and reading this particular part of the passage, like, oh, okay, like I made a couple hops, but
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't justified in making those hops because for what is being said there, someone could make a couple hops in a different direction, right?
Right.
So it's like, I'm just going to take this very flat out. What what does this mean? Um,
Yep.
it becomes a lot easier to differentiate the answer choices, and then I think that's a skill that I try to have students, get to that point and start realizing like the nuance between these things, and then it obviously does take time, but then it in building these skills, then RC becomes much faster, right? Yeah,
Yep.
it's the same thing that we talked about LR, right? Where it's like, I'm translating this unless without, and spending a little bit more time in stimulus, but we're being very intentional with how we're engaging and working with this, so that as a whole, we keep building on these skills and it becomes more comfortable. Been there, done that. I know what to do. I'm training these skills for a smoother ride, a smoother and more visible ride. I see the environments, I see the traps. Like, you
Yeah.
guys always try to play that same trap. Like I know it. Like, let me move the car a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and the must be true thing really kind of cracks the whole LSAT open. I love what you
Yeah.
were saying about, oh, I made some assumptions here, and there's actually I took some steps in this direction, but just as legitimately,
So,
somebody could have taken steps in a different
yeah.
direction.
Yeah.
You bring that into logical reasoning, like most, must be true questions are pretty prevalent, but most of the time you're going to see argumentation. If you bring that
Yes.
must be true skill to argumentation and or in logical reasoning, you say, does the conclusion have to be true given the evidence that they gave to support it? You can say, oh, well, I can see some of these assumptions here and this. All of
Yeah.
a sudden, you can weaken that argument. You can strengthen that argument. You know what the flaw is. You know what the necessary
Yeah.
assumptions are. You know what the sufficient assumptions are. You can parallel that. Like you can go,
You.
you can start to
Yeah.
do everything.
Yeah. You can shield. You can help. Like here. Like You have
Yeah,
there's a couple holes in your ship. Like, let me help you out. You know, and it
exactly.
really just changes it. You're seeing things that you otherwise didn't even know
Right.
like were there. Yeah,
You couldn't even see it. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's awesome. Thank you so much, JP. I really appreciate the insights. Hopefully, people get a ton of value out of this. Great chatting with you as always, and I'll see you next week.